decades, a handful of foreign mining corporations operated some of the most profitable gold extraction contracts in West Africa, from inside Burkina Faso. The arrangement was simple, and it had barely changed since the colonial era. Foreign companies held the mining rights. Foreign companies controlled the extraction technology. Foreign companies repatriated the overwhelming majority of the profits to shareholders in Europe, North America, and beyond. Burkina Faso, the country whose soil contained the gold, received a fraction of the actual value through royalty payments and tax structures that had been negotiated decades earlier, often under governments with limited leverage to demand better terms. Then Captain Ibrahim Traoré took power. And he asked a question that foreign mining executives had spent generations hoping no Burkinabe leader would ever ask seriously enough to act on. Why does our gold leave this country while our people remain poor? What followed was a systematic restructuring of the mining sector that fundamentally altered the economics for every foreign company operating in Burkina Faso. This is the story of how that restructuring happened and why it changed everything. To understand what Traoré dismantled, you need to understand how thoroughly the previous system had been designed to favor foreign extraction over domestic development. Burkina Faso's modern gold mining sector developed largely in the 2000s and 2010s as foreign mining companies, predominantly Canadian, with additional European and other international players, secured extraction licenses across the country's significant gold deposits. These licenses were typically negotiated under mining codes that offered remarkably favorable terms to foreign operators, limited royalty obligations, generous tax exemptions during initial operating years, and contractual structures that allowed the bulk of extracted value to flow out of the country with minimal domestic value addition. Burkina Faso became, over the following 2 decades, one of the largest gold producers in West Africa. Production volumes climbed year after year, and yet the country remained one of the poorest nations on earth by conventional development metrics, with the majority of its population engaged in subsistence agriculture and minimal benefit flowing from the mineral wealth being extracted from beneath their land. This was not a coincidence. It was the structural outcome of mining codes and contracts written to maximize extraction efficiency and shareholder return for foreign operators, with domestic development treated as a secondary consideration at best. For successive Burkinabe governments operating within the broader constraints of the CFA franc monetary system and continued French economic influence, renegotiating these arrangements carried significant political risk. Foreign mining companies represented substantial direct investment and formal employment. Threatening that relationship risked capital flight, diplomatic friction, and economic disruption that fragile governments were reluctant to provoke. The arrangement persisted for generations, largely unchallenged, until September 20. Traoré's approach to the mining sector followed the same first principles logic that would later define his agricultural, infrastructure, and energy strategies. Rather than nationalizing every mining operation outright in a single dramatic seizure, an approach that would have triggered immediate international legal challenges and likely catastrophic capital flight, his government pursued a more methodical restructuring of the terms under which foreign companies could continue operating. The mining codes governing royalty rates, tax obligations, and profit repatriation structures were comprehensively reviewed and revised, demanding dramatically higher revenue shares from foreign extraction companies operating on Burkinabe soil. Companies that had spent decades operating under historically favorable terms suddenly faced a fundamentally different cost structure. Royalty obligations increased substantially. Tax exemption periods were narrowed. Requirements around local processing, employment, and value addition were strengthened. For mining executives who had built their financial projections and shareholder commitments around the previous regulatory environment, this represented a direct and significant impact on operational profitability. Some companies adjusted and continued operating under the new terms, recalculating their cost structures to remain viable within Burkina Faso's revised framework. Others found the new terms incompatible with their existing investment models, leading to operational scalebacks, contract renegotiations, or in some cases, complete exit from Burkinabe operations. The revised mining codes were only the first half of Traoré's strategy. The second half was what happened to the additional revenue these changes generated. Rather than absorbing the increased gold revenue into general government spending or opaque budget allocations, Traoré's government channeled it with striking specificity into the development initiatives that would come to define his entire presidency. The connection was made explicit and repeated. The agro-pastoral and fisheries offensive, the nearly $1 billion agricultural transformation program, was funded by redirecting state revenues specifically from the nationalization of gold mines, stripping value that previously flowed to foreign shareholders and redirecting it to feed the nation. The over $300 million in free tractors, power tillers, and water pumps distributed to Burkina farmers traced directly back to this redirected gold revenue. The 900 pieces of heavy machinery purchased outright, not financed through foreign loans, and handed to military engineers for the Faso Mayabo road-building initiative were paid for with the same gold-derived state funds. This pattern repeated across virtually every major infrastructure and development project examined throughout Burkina Faso's transformation: the irrigation perimeters, the rice and wheat processing facilities, the solar power deployment. Even private sector projects like the Burkina skyscraper benefited from the broader macroeconomic stability that redirected gold revenue helped create. For the first time in the country's modern history, gold extracted from Burkina soil was being converted, at meaningful scale, into infrastructure and development that Burkina citizens could directly see, use, and benefit from. The reaction from Western mining interests and the broader Western policy establishment was swift and at times openly hostile. Industry analysts and mining sector publications began characterizing Burkina Faso's revised regulatory environment as a significant deterioration in investment climate, warning that increased royalty and tax obligations would discourage future foreign mining investment and potentially undermine the sector's long-term productive capacity. Some of this criticism reflected genuine technical concerns about long-term sector sustainability. Mining operations require substantial ongoing capital investment, and dramatically altering the terms under which that capital is deployed can, in some circumstances, discourage the kind of exploration and development investment that sustains production over decades. But much of the criticism carried an unmistakable undertone that went beyond technical investment analysis. When U.S. General Michael Langley publicly suggested that Burkina Faso's government was misusing its gold reserves, implying the revenue was being directed toward regime self-preservation rather than genuine public benefit, he was articulating a broader Western skepticism toward the entire restructuring effort that extended well beyond narrow technical concerns about mining sector competitiveness. The underlying anxiety was not difficult to identify. A government that successfully demonstrated it could renegotiate extraction terms with foreign mining companies, redirect the resulting revenue into visible, productive domestic infrastructure, and maintain sufficient stability to continue operating, represented a direct challenge to the broader assumption that African nations required foreign capital, foreign expertise, and foreign favorable terms to develop their own natural resources. Let's be specific about what changed for foreign mining operations under the revised framework, because the practical impact extended well beyond headline royalty percentages. Profit repatriation became significantly more constrained, with new requirements directing a larger share of extraction value toward domestic processing, local employment, and direct government revenue before any profit could be transferred abroad to parent companies and shareholders. Local processing requirements meant that companies could no longer simply extract raw ore or minimally processed gold and ship it abroad for refining and value addition elsewhere. Greater value addition was required to occur on Burkina soil, directly reducing the margin captured by foreign processing facilities that had historically handled this stage of the value chain. Employment and local content requirements pushed companies to hire and train Burkina personnel for technical and management roles that had previously been filled predominantly by foreign expatriate staff, gradually reducing the foreign personnel costs that had represented a significant ongoing expense flowing out of the country. For mining companies whose entire operational and financial model had been built around the previous far more favorable framework, these combined changes represented a fundamental restructuring of the economics underlying their Burkina operations. Some companies that had projected decades of operation under the old terms found their revised cost structures incompatible with continued profitability at the scale they had originally planned. This is what losing everything meant in practical terms. Not physical seizure of mining equipment or facilities in most cases, but the comprehensive collapse of the favorable economic terms that had made those operations so profitable in the first place. Not every foreign mining company exited Burkina Faso following the regulatory restructuring. Some adapted their operational models to the new requirements, accepting reduced profit margins in exchange for continued access to Burkina Faso's substantial gold deposits, recognizing that the underlying geological wealth remained valuable even under less favorable extraction terms. These companies restructured their local operations to increase Burkina employment in technical and management roles, expanded local processing capacity to meet the new value addition requirements, and recalibrated their financial projections around the new royalty and tax structure. This transition was not without friction. Reports from within the sector describe tension between companies seeking to minimize the operational impact of compliance with new requirements, and a government determined to ensure the spirit, not merely the technical letter, of the revised mining codes was honored. But the companies that successfully navigated this transition demonstrated something important. Profitable gold mining in Burkina Faso remained possible under terms that captured substantially more value for the domestic economy than the previous framework had allowed. This outcome directly undermined a key argument that opponents of the restructuring had advanced, that demanding higher domestic value capture would simply drive all foreign investment away entirely, leaving Burkina Faso's gold deposits undeveloped and the broader economy worse off. Instead, a hybrid outcome emerged. Some companies exited, some adapted and continued operating profitably under substantially improved terms for Burkina Faso, and the government simultaneously developed expanded capacity for direct state involvement in portions of the sector previously dominated entirely by foreign operators. The gold mining restructuring did not happen in isolation. It represented the first and arguably most consequential application of a sovereignty framework that Traoré would go on to apply systematically across nearly every sector of the Burkinabe economy. The same logic that restructured gold mining terms, identify where foreign control was extracting disproportionate value relative to domestic benefit, renegotiate or redirect that value toward Burkinabe priorities, and accept short-term friction in exchange for long-term structural change, appears throughout the broader transformation. It appears in the decision to purchase Chinese heavy machinery outright with cash, rather than accepting bundled financing and construction contracts that would have created decades-long dependency relationships. It appears in the decision to import Brazilian cattle genetics directly, rather than depending on traditional European dairy development partnerships. It appears in the ban on foreign broiler chick imports that forced the development of the domestically engineered Poulet Faso breed. It appears in the shea nut export restrictions that forced local processing rather than continued raw material extraction. Traoré has been explicit that gold sovereignty sits underneath all of these subsequent transformations as a foundational precondition. Without the restructured mining revenue, the capital required to fund free tractors, irrigation infrastructure, road-building machinery, and processing facilities simply would not have existed at the scale required to drive transformation across so many sectors simultaneously. If you don't have food sovereignty, if you don't have energy sovereignty, if you don't have technological sovereignty, then you don't really have full independence. Gold sovereignty made the pursuit of every other form of sovereignty financially possible. It is worth addressing directly the question of legal and contractual legitimacy that Western mining interests and their government backers raised throughout this process. Mining contracts and codes, like any commercial agreement, carry legal weight, and unilateral revision of terms by a host government raises legitimate questions about contract sanctity and investment predictability that matter for any nation's long-term ability to attract foreign capital across any sector, not just mining. Traoré's government did not claim these revisions were costless or risk-free. The explicit acceptance of potential capital flight, reduced foreign investment, and international criticism reflects a calculated judgment that the long-term benefit of capturing substantially more domestic value from Burkina Faso's mineral wealth outweighed the risks of operating with a less foreign investor-friendly reputation in the near term. This calculation echoes a pattern visible across numerous historical examples of resource-rich nations renegotiating extraction terms with foreign companies, from Gulf states renegotiating oil concessions in the mid-20th century to various Latin American nations restructuring mining and energy contracts in subsequent decades. These renegotiations have produced genuinely mixed long-term outcomes across different historical cases, depending heavily on how the redirected revenue was subsequently managed and deployed. What distinguishes Burkina Faso's case, at least in its early results, is the unusually direct and traceable connection between the renegotiated mining revenue and visible productive domestic infrastructure, a connection that is considerably harder to establish in many historical examples where redirected resource revenue disappeared into less transparent government spending. For decades, the gold beneath Burkina Faso's soil enriched shareholders thousands of kilometers away, while the nation that owned that soil remained trapped in cycles of poverty, foreign dependency, and underdevelopment that foreign mining executives rarely had reason to question. The arrangement worked exactly as designed for the companies benefiting from it. Captain Ibrahim Traoré looked at that arrangement and asked the question that foreign mining executives had spent generations hoping no Burkinabe leader would act on seriously enough to actually restructure. He revised the mining codes. He demanded substantially higher domestic value capture. He redirected the resulting revenue with explicit, traceable specificity into the agricultural, infrastructure, and energy transformation that has defined his presidency. Some Western mining companies adapted to the new reality and continue operating profitably under Burkina Faso's revised terms. Others found the new economics incompatible with their previous models and scaled back or exited entirely. What none of them could do was return to the previous arrangement, where Burkinabe gold flowed out and Burkinabe development lagged behind in permanent structural fashion. $300 million in free tractors, 900 pieces of road-building machinery purchased outright, solar irrigation systems pumping thousands of cubic meters of water per hour, a rice processing facility ranked among Africa's top 10, a 35-story tower rising in the capital. All of it traceable, in significant part, back to a single restructuring decision that Western mining interests never expected a young Burkinabe captain to actually follow through on. They held the gold contracts for generations. He signed the documents that changed what those contracts meant, and the companies that built their entire Burkinabe operations around the old arrangement discovered in real time exactly how much had depended on a status quo that no longer existed.